I'm so glad to be here and listening to the presentation before and all of the trauma that we heard, right? We all just sat in a room and listened to horrific stories. And I'm going to tell you some more. I'm sorry. But that's the reality of it, of this work, of all of this work that you all are doing. We can't turn a blind eye to what is happening. And yet, we also have to make sure that we take pause and we take care and we have community and fellowship. And so I'm delighted to just be able to be a part of this so that we can talk about these really hard things and also come together and find joy and peace together. So I want to tell you a little bit about myself, how I came to do this work, a little bit about Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, or FADP, as we like to call it. And I do have a table in the back with some information. I encourage you to stop by. And then I want to tell you all what you can do. So I want you to understand what's happening in Florida with respect to the death penalty so that you're aware of it, and then give you information on how we together can bring the death penalty to its rightful end, starting in Florida. So I've been an attorney 20 years now, just hit my 20th year, which seems insane to me. It feels like I just started law school yesterday. But I started as an assistant state attorney. I was a prosecutor in law school and then in Miami. So I've been on both sides of the criminal justice system. I grew up in Pennsylvania. I went to Penn State, and I had enough of the cold weather, and I just decided to move to Florida. I didn't know a single soul. I took a job at the Miami State Attorney's Office. My family thought I was nuts. They're like, you can't just leave. And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm going. It's warmer there. And so I moved to Miami, and I worked as a state attorney for 3 years. And that was really where I got my first taste of the criminal justice system and how broken it is. And I loved being a prosecutor. I thought I was doing justice. I thought I was keeping people safe. And I was, to a certain extent. But as a prosecutor, you're really limited. I can put people in jail, but I can't really solve the problem of violence, and I can't really solve the cycle of violence. And the professor that spoke before me talked a lot about trauma and what happens to people. What happens to those traumatized when they don't get resources is they become my clients. Every single one of my death penalty clients had some kind of trauma in their childhood. You don't get on death row if you had a happy, safe, and well-adjusted childhood. You just don't. And so as a state attorney, I felt a little bit hamstrung in my ability to make a difference. And so in 2006, I was there for about 3 years. I was moving to Tampa for personal reasons. I was looking for a job, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And I learned about this state agency called Capital Collateral Regional Counsel. Florida does a million things wrong about the death penalty, which I will talk to you about this morning, but they do one thing right. They make sure that every single person on death row has a lawyer, from the moment they're arrested for a capital offense all the way through either execution, release, or natural death. So we have 3 state agencies here that is basically like a public defender's office just for people sentenced and convicted and sentenced to death and already serving a death sentence. So kind of a quick briefer on what happens. Somebody gets charged with a capital defense. They get the death penalty. We call it affirmed on direct appeal, right? The case goes to the Florida Supreme Court, and they say, yes, the trial was fine, the death penalty is appropriate. Then one of these 3 offices get appointed. CCRC is what we sort of call it, and I worked in the middle region. And so all of my cases came to me via court appointment. Over the years there, I represented probably 30 or 40 individuals, one of whom I'll talk with you about this morning. He is one of Florida's 30 death row exonerees. His name is Clemente Aguirre Jarquin. He is a Honduran national, fled Honduras, much like we spoke this morning because of the MS-13 violence there, had a harrowing journey to make it to the United States, made it here, was sending money to his mom in Honduras, working 4 jobs in the Orlando area, and was wrongfully convicted of murdering his next-door neighbors. He spent 14 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, 10 of them on death row. He was exonerated by DNA, and I'll tell you a little bit about his story and how he came back to attend the last execution with me. I represented him for about 10 years, I guess. I started his case in 2009. So while I was at that agency, I did all of my work on death row. Every single one of my clients was sentenced to death and spending time at UCI Rayford, which is where we house death row. During that time, I had 2 clients that were executed, and I represented countless others. And then I was actually running that agency. My boss, it's a political appointment, so it's appointed by the governor in Florida, and I was running the office. He had retired early, and he had named me as his successor. You have to go through a political appointment process, and I am a registered Democrat and a female under the age of 40, and the governor was Governor Scott at the time, did not approve my appointment and chose someone who was actually pro-death penalty to run the office. So it was pretty devastating for the movement in general, but also, led me into a little bit of transition, which I kind of firmly and fully believe that everything happens for a reason, and then we kind of end up exactly where we're supposed to be. One of the criticisms against me, someone had written a letter, and they called me a bomb-throwing abolitionist, which, I'm trying to abolish the death penalty. I thought that was pretty clear. So when I applied to be the executive director at FADP, I actually gave them that letter, because it's really actually a character letter in support of how can I lead an abolitionist organization. So it all worked out for me. I left there in January of 2019. I joined the Public Defender's Office in the 6th Circuit, where I am now, and I do capital defense work. I actually have a death penalty trial starting on Monday, which is why after I'm done speaking, I'm getting on a plane to fly back to Tampa, and I wish I could stay longer to chat with you all, but my card and information is back there, so I really do encourage you to reach out. So I've joined the Public Defender's Office in March of 2019, and I've been there ever since. I was also in private practice for a little period of time, because I was working part-time at the Public Defender's Office, doing just death penalty work, some first-degree murder cases, appeals, things like that. And then I started working with FADP, and Celeste Fitzgerald, who I believe spoke at this conference last year. She's one of our consultants, a dear friend, and she was kind of running behind the scenes at FADP, and they got a big grant to hire an executive director, their first sort of full-time paid executive director. And I had worked with the organization. They had asked my input on some lethal injection litigation, things like that. And I was really impressed by what they were saying. Like, Celeste had a plan to end the death penalty in Florida through legislative abolition, and I was like, you're nuts. I was like, have you seen what's happening here? And she's like, no, there's a lot of support. There's a lot of support in Florida. And one of the main sources of support is our Catholic community, and the commitment to ending the death penalty, and the commitment to protect life from conception to natural death. And she sort of opened my eyes to what's out there. And then it sort of came that they were looking for an executive director, and I was sort of half joking with some friends of mine. I was really kind of done in private practice, and I wanted to do something different. And I was like, I think I might apply. And she told Celeste, and she was like, what? Maria wants to be the executive, bring her on. And I was like, I don't know. I went back and forth, and I just decided to jump in. And I'm so glad that I did. And wow, has it been a year and a half. When I joined FADP as the executive director in June of 2022, we hadn't had an execution in 3 years. We had achieved unanimity in our jury sentencing, so we were no longer the outlier. Florida, for a very long time, was one of the only states in the nation that allowed a death sentence by a vote of 7-5. So in Florida, if you steal a pack of gum, you're entitled to unanimous jury determination of your guilt. But to kill you, only 7 of 12 jurors have to say so. We fought in the legal community for a very long time to change that law. And it changed. The US Supreme Court in 2016 struck that down and said, Florida, get in line. You've got to be unanimous for the death penalty. Our Florida Supreme Court agreed. And that was happening. When I took over, we had unanimity. We hadn't had an execution since 2019. Fast forward to fall, actually, it was a year ago yesterday, the Parkland verdict in South Florida. the Nicholas Cruz case, which was an unimaginable, horrible, horrific tragedy. 17 lives lost, many of them young people. And the state of Florida sought the death penalty. Mr. Cruz's lawyers, and he was 19 years old at the time, suffered, again, traumatic upbringing, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, all of the terrible traumatic things that we know happen. And yet his lawyers had offered 34 consecutive life sentences to resolve his case within like a week of his arrest. And the state said no. And so for 4 years, they dragged the community, the victims' families, everyone through this nightmare. They kept the school exactly the way that it was the day of the massacre. Those students had to go by that building every single day for 4 years, just so that the state could parade the jury through in an effort to seek the death penalty. And what happened was 3 jurors chose life. And in Florida, because we worked to change the law, that meant that the exact outcome that the defense attorneys had offered 4 years previously was what was going to happen. The Parkland shooter will never be released from prison. He will remain there for the remainder of his natural life. But life was chosen. And it was a beautiful thing. And at the same time, we knew the backlash was coming. Because people couldn't quite wrap their minds around, if we have the death penalty, why not this case? And I was like, let's talk about the first question, right? If we have the death penalty. This case shows that we don't need it, and that people feel, once they really listen to the story, that it's not appropriate. Unfortunately, kind of a perfect storm of things took place, and so in January of this year, I was actually climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. It was a bucket list item of mine, and a dear friend of mine and I decided to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. And so we went to Africa in January, beautiful country, did a safari, and then we did our hike. So, about 8 days, I don't have cell phone service because I'm on a giant mountain. And everyone knew, my team, everybody knew. I was like, look, I'm not available, but I'll be back on this specific day. I came off the mountain, back to base camp, turn on my phone, there's a death warrant. Donald Dilbeck, first execution set for February, hadn't had an execution in 4 years. His jury vote was 8-4. The other thing that happened is the legislature introduced legislation in response to Parkland to remove unanimity. And I was like, I'm going back to the mountain. Like, I don't want to do this, right? And it became a tremendous battle. And I spent a lot of time in the legislature this January and February. We had tremendous support. The Florida Conference of Catholic Bishops helped us tremendously. But we were really up against a tide. The Parkland families, everybody felt that an injustice had been done. And so the legislature did ultimately spend their time expanding the death penalty. We now have the easiest standard in the country to get death. So it's 8-4 instead of 7-5. But no other state in the country allows only 8 jurors to determine death. We've also expanded the death penalty for non-homicide crimes. So the legislature also, in direct violation of U.S. Supreme Court precedent, said that the death penalty is an appropriate penalty for sexual battery of a child under 12. And again, it's really difficult for politicians to stand up and say no to that legislation, and there's probably very, very small number of folks who did, because it's that, if you think of a crime, we just listened to the horrific what happens to children when they are sexually assaulted. It's a lifelong traumatic thing that is incredibly difficult to overcome. However, seeking the death penalty only prolongs that harm for that child, right? This is a living child who has to testify, who has to bear the weight of a death sentence. Sadly, we know that a lot of times child sexual abuse happens from someone that the child knows and trusts, in the family, in the community, a teacher, a loved one. So there's a lot of mixed emotions and feelings, and imagine putting that child under the age of 12 with the idea that they're responsible for a death sentence for someone. And I mean, I spoke for hours to our legislators, to our community members, begging them not to do this. And they did it, and they did it anyway. And I think eventually both of those laws that were passed this year will be found unconstitutional. The US Supreme Court already told us once we have to have unanimity. I think they'll tell us again. But there's going to be people's lives lost along the way. And so the other thing that has happened, of course, this year, the execution of Donald Dilbeck was the first. We've had 6. Florida has executed 6 people this year. We were in the lead for most executions. Texas just executed someone last week, so we both have 6 now. The most recent execution was Michael Zach, which was just 2 weeks ago. I've lost track of time. And we are constantly living on edge that we're going to have another execution. So in Florida, unlike other states, it is solely up to the governor to determine whether there's an execution date. There's not a court process. Somebody has to get through the entire appellate process to be eligible, but then it is entirely up to the governor to determine. So Governor DeSantis literally holds the power of life and death in his hands, and he gets to choose the next person. And so everybody in the community, not just me, one of the lawyers working on these cases, but the men on the row. So I had a client tell me once that whenever a warrant is signed and there's a date, the guards in the white shirts, they're sort of the lieutenants and the sort of higher up in the prison, they wear white, so they just call them the white shirts. They come down the row and they read the warrant to the person, and then they take them out of the Union Correctional over to Florida State Prison for Death Watch. And so the door to the way the death row is, it's like kind of these long, it's sort of like a spoke and then like a Trivial Pursuit piece around it. And so there's like a central area, and then you walk down the hall. And so the door opens, and that's when they walk down, right? But what he explained to me was, he said, Maria, so you hear the door, it's like a very loud buzz door, and then the heavy metal opens. That happens like 30 times a day because of other people moving and trays and things like that. And so these men that are waiting for their execution date that they don't know when would come, 30 times a day hear that noise and have to wonder, is it me? Am I next? And that kind of torture is just pretty horrific to imagine, regardless of the acts that they've done to get there, because we'll talk about that for a little while as well. I'm not going to pretend that some of my clients who are on death row haven't committed horrific acts, because they have, and they've taken life, and they've caused untold pain. And yet, I know and believe that we are all more than the worst thing that we've ever done. And that's true for them too. And what the death penalty says is, I don't care about redemption. I don't care about forgiveness. I don't believe people can change. And I don't think that's who we are. I know that's not who we are in this room. And I don't think the rest of Florida feels that way either. And what I want to implore of you, and as we leave here today, and I'll leave you with it when we're finished, is like, I want us to tell the truth about who we're executing and what exactly we're doing. I don't want us to turn a blind eye. And believe me, it's easy to want to, because there's so much sadness and so much trauma around it. And there's so many causes that we want to fight for, right? And we only have so much energy. But for me, the death penalty has always been at the forefront of my career and my dedication to bringing about its end in Florida. So I want to tell you a little bit about Clemente Aguirre, who was my client who I represented for 10 years, because he actually attended the execution vigil of Michael Zach with me last week. And so I just want to walk through his story a little bit for you this morning. He, like I said, came from Honduras. He fled the gang violence. Basically, he went to school in an area that was ruled by MS-13, and he lived in an area that was 18th Street. And so he had to navigate these two rival gangs at school and at home. And he's a really little guy. When I went to Honduras, I felt super giant because I was very tall, and I'm not tall at all. He's 4'11", and he wasn't safe. One of his friends was killed by a rival gang, and the police just sort of tossed his body in the ambulance because they just thought, oh, he's another gang member. He wasn't. And Clemente was like, I'm going to be next. And so his mom, he was a young man, he was in his early 20s. Family scraped up money together. It was $5,000. That was going to be my guess as far as how to get here, but it cost him $5,000 to make his way to the United States. He made his way through Mexico, and he came into the country. And he came into the country illegally, no question about that. He would have, however, been eligible for asylum at the time, the way our laws were at the time. He didn't file for asylum right away. He was in his early 20s. He came to the United States. He was living in a trailer park in Altamont Springs, Florida, just outside of Orlando, with some friends that he had met through his sister who lived there. He was working 3 jobs. He was working as a cook. He was working in a restaurant. He was doing landscaping. He didn't speak any English. And he lived in a trailer park called Vagabond Way, which is just like the greatest name for a trailer park in Florida. I couldn't make it up. And so his next door neighbors were 3 women, a mother, a grandmother, and the granddaughter. And they social, this was a really poor area, a lot of mental illness, a lot of substance abuse. And yet they were doing their best, right? It was kind of a community that tried to stay together. They had a lot of parties, they had cookouts. He was friends with them. Didn't speak to them all that much because of the language barrier and because of how much he was working. And he was drinking. He was drinking and he was using drugs and he was partying, and he had just sort of come to this country and he wasn't making the best choices. Again, he was also in his early 20s and working as hard as he could to send money home to his mom in Honduras. And so one morning, he routinely would go to his neighbor's house. They always had beer. They always had something to drink. He had been out with his friends, and he wanted to keep the party going. He wasn't quite ready. He had the day off. So he goes to the trailer, and he tries to open the door. And they had an open door policy. He went there all the time. He opens the door, and one of the women is laying on the floor covered in blood. She's stabbed 129 times. And he, panics and also goes to her, right? And he like picks her up and he's like, "Are you okay?" And in the process gets her blood on his clothes. Maybe not how you or I would react to seeing someone who's that violently deceased, but remember, when he was like 10 in Honduras, some gang member came through his soccer game and just shot a bunch of people. He didn't have the same experience that you or I had. He witnessed violence on a regular basis, and these were his friends. Then he looks to the other room because he knows there's a grandmother who's in there. She's also deceased, stabbed twice, once in the chest and once in the back. He sees a knife laying there with blood on it, and he's like, is the killer still in the house? He picks up the knife, and he starts walking through the house. Again, we're not talking about the best decisions. I mean, he did not make the best decisions. I'm not going to pretend that he did. However, he knew other people lived in the house. He knew there was a daughter that was about his age that lived there. He walks through the trailer, and when the crime scene pictures, his footprints are in blood, right? And they're like, I don't know if y'all remember the Family Circus cartoons where like the footprints are like around things, right? There's a chair knocked over. His footprints are around that. There's a mirror on the floor. His footprints on the back of that. All of these things indicating that he came there after the violence. Then he comes back, he sees nobody else in the house, he comes back through, and he doesn't know what to do. If he calls the police, he's here illegally, he's gonna get deported. If he goes back to Honduras, he can't send money to his mom, and he's likely to be killed by the gang. So he goes home, next door. He tosses the knife, and he goes home, and he takes off his clothes, which have blood on them, and he's like, puts them in a bag and tosses them on the roof, and he's like, he just doesn't know what to do. Panics, tries to go to sleep. Later that morning, the granddaughter, who was not home at the time, was at her boyfriend's house. She sends her boyfriend over to get her laundry out of the trailer, and she tells him, I have a bad feeling. That becomes important later. So the boyfriend goes over, he opens the door, he then now finds 2 deceased women, he calls 911, and the police come. And as the daughter eventually comes by, the boyfriend and the daughter start saying, well, there's this next door neighbor, he's like a little Mexican guy, I don't know, he kind of hangs around, maybe it was him, sort of thing. And it's strange because they don't know that he went in the house, but they plan to pin it on him anyway. And so the cops come, they talk to everybody, they talk to Clemente and the next door neighbors, they don't speak English, they don't bring a Spanish-speaking detective, and he's like, I don't know anything, because again, he's still afraid. A couple of hours later, he's talking to his friends, he's like, I have to go tell them what I know, I have to tell the truth, like, this is America, like, they'll believe me. Mistake number 7 that he made. So he goes and talks to the police, and he's like, hey, I want you to know I went in the house. And they were like, case closed. They're like, he gave them his clothes, he told them they have footprints now, and they're like, they don't believe anything else he says. And they start accusing him of rape and of murder, and there was no evidence of sexual assault, but the police are sort of allowed to lie in interrogations, and they start telling him all this stuff, and he's like, take my DNA, like, here, take my hair, take my blood. Like, he's like, I didn't, he was adamant that he didn't kill these women. They arrested him anyway. He's charged with first-degree murder. The state seeks the death penalty. He's represented by the Public Defender's Office in Seminole County. I work for a public defender's office. I am a proud public defender. There are some excellent public defender's offices in this country and in this state, and there are some terrible public defender's offices in this country and this state. And unfortunately for Clemente, his lawyers were 2 of the most unprepared, ineffective lawyers I have ever seen in my 20 years of doing this work. They didn't believe him. They didn't care. They just thought he was guilty. They never called his mom in Honduras. Like, if you represent somebody facing the death penalty, the first thing you do is, like, call the client's mom, right? Like, I mean, everybody has that. It's just such a basic premise. And the lawyer was like, well, I didn't know the country code. I mean, it was those kind of, absurd things that happened. They didn't do any DNA testing. This is 2004 that he's arrested. So his trial went in 2006. So, I mean, this is not a case where DNA didn't exist. I mean, we had DNA. He had the ability to have this stuff tested. The police had collected 150 bloodstains from the house because in a stabbing case, quite typically, the killer gets cut. You stab someone 129 times, you're going to have some cuts on your hands. And there was, the way the crime scene pattern was, drips and drops of blood that we suspected belonged to the actual killer. And a good lawyer at the time would have suspected the same. They did nothing. They didn't do any investigation. He was convicted based on the state's case. I mean, he's the only guy there. He has his blood on him. He did stupid things. He didn't call the police. And so he's convicted and he's sentenced to death. And at the time, it was non-unanimous. So his jury vote was 7-5. For the woman that was stabbed 129 times, the jury said 7-5. And the other woman was 9-3. And what we know and what we learned, and part of the reason we fought so hard against non-unanimity, is that it leads to more wrongful convictions than any other system. So Florida has an unfortunate distinction of having the most people exonerated from death row, 30. 30 times Florida has gotten it wrong. 30 men have been exonerated from death row for crimes they didn't commit. 93% of them, so almost every single one of them, had a non-unanimous jury verdict. Because what happens is the jury, we call it a death-qualified jury, which I will be picking on Monday, again, in a case that is in Pinellas County, where guilt is not an issue, but we're trying very, very hard to save this man's life. And what happens is the jury is death qualified. You don't get to be on a jury in a death penalty case unless you believe in the death penalty. So if you say, I can never impose the death penalty, you're not allowed to be on a capital jury. So it's not a jury of your peers. It's a jury of people who already believe in the death penalty. And so what happens and what statistics show and the studies show is that those folks are more likely to convict. But then what will happen is if there's some doubt, then that'll be reflected in the vote. So that's why we see this non-unanimity. So people get death sentences who are innocent, but they get so from a non-unanimous point, which is one of the main reasons we argued against the return to non-unanimity and of course lost. So Clemente goes to death row, he goes through his direct appeal, and then my office, CCRC, gets appointed. And I met him, and he and I speak a lot together. And I met him in the summer of 2009, and I went to Florida State Prison to see him. And he comes out, and at this point, he has taught himself English somewhat. It's much better now, but he learned English while on death row, and which is amazing and remarkable to me. But he was angry because he had really terrible lawyers who didn't listen to him for a long time. And so I met him, and I was like, hi, I'm your lawyer. He's like, you're not my lawyer. I'm like, no, like I am. And he was like, well, I don't trust you. I'm like, okay, you don't have to. Because that's how I approach it. I did nothing for him I didn't earn his trust. All I said was, hello, I'm your lawyer. And so I just operated with the idea of you get to be as mad as you want to be because you got a raw deal. And let's see if we can work together. And it took time, over time. Eventually he knew to trust us and that we were trying to do the right thing. And for me, I was a prosecutor. I did this work for a long time before I got Clemente's case. But his case, there was something wrong about it. You don't stab somebody 129 times unless there's some kind of relationship, right? And he was just their next door neighbor. There was no indication of any animosity or violence or anything like that. So we started talking about doing DNA testing. We consulted with the Innocence Project, and we started investigating other suspects. For me, the first moment that I knew that he was innocent was when I went to the bar. So the night before the murders, he was at a bar until about 3 a.m. And it was established that he was there because there was a bar fight. He wasn't involved in it, but the police had come and he was a witness. So they had, taken his name down. And the state argued that he killed them that morning, and we had expert testimony that they were actually killed the night before. So we were trying to establish time of death was closer to midnight and not like 7 a.m. And of course, Clemente had an alibi until 3 a.m. So the lawyers never went to this bar. They didn't even walk in. I mean, it was like 10 minutes from their office, and they didn't even walk in, just like talk to a single person that was in there. So my investigator and I went on a Saturday morning, and again, this was probably 2010, so we're talking 6 years after the murder. And in capital defense work, you don't generally call and announce your presence because you want people to tell you the truth, and you just sort of show up. You don't want the doors slammed in your face. So we go into the bar. It's like 11:30 in the morning, and we sit down. The bartender's like, "Can I get you something?" And I was like, "Actually, I'm looking for Bob Buntrock. He was the owner. Is he here?" And she was like, "No, but like he'll be in later. What can I do for you?" And I said, "Well, I'm a lawyer and I represent Clemente Aguirre." And it was like the record scratch. Like she almost dropped the bottle she was holding, and she just looked at me and she said, "Oh my God, I'm so glad someone is finally helping him. I know he didn't do it." And I still have chills telling that story because, again, it had been 6 years. This woman didn't know I was coming. She didn't know a single thing about it. She had no idea that I was going to walk in there and talk about Clemente. And she was like, "I think it was the daughter." She hated her mother. They fought constantly. The daughter had worked in that bar as well. They fought all the time. And her mother had a lot of issues, substance abuse, abuse of the daughter, lots of things that we sort of typically see. The irony of all of this is if we had represented the daughter, we would have been heavily advocating for a life sentence and not the death penalty because of the trauma that she suffered. So we continue to focus our investigation. We start to investigate the daughter. She'd been Baker acted for, I think, 60 times, violent outbursts, had threatened to kill her mom. And now we've got this DNA, right? We test 150 blood stains. And 8 of those blood drops came back belonging to the daughter. So her daughter was the daughter's blood was in 8 places in the crime scene, including in the bathroom where the state argued my client had cleaned up. So there was a back bathroom that had some towels in it, and they said that's where he went to clean up. But they never tested the DNA. And the state at trial said, well, we can't test everything. We'd be here for weeks. And so they just argued that the killer cleaned up in the bathroom. So we've got her blood on the floor within inches of her mother and grandmother's blood. So we're like, this is 2012 when we get the DNA. And we're like, the state, clearly they have to agree, right? Like, you've got the wrong guy. And we meet with the state attorney, and they're like, no, your guy's guilty. She lived in the house. Her blood's old. Sometimes she told me, she testified in a hearing, and she said, well, maybe I swatted a mosquito. And that's how my blood got on the wall. And it's like, for me, and I used to be a prosecutor, right? And like the idea of continuing to prosecute somebody who's all of the evidence points against it's horrifying. And so we litigated this. So 2012, we had a 2-week evidentiary hearing. In 2013, the judge that presided over his case tried to use his case to get like a promotion to a higher court. She denied us. She said, that blood must be old. It's her statements. I guess I should also tell you, she also admitted that she killed her mother and grandmother. She was Baker acted, and she told the police that demons in her head made her kill her family. She told neighbors that she killed her mother and grandmother. We brought in all of that evidence. We had 5 confessions and her blood at the crime scene, and this judge said, nah, your guy's guilty. So we go to the Florida Supreme Court. We actually enlisted the help of a law firm in Alabama because I will stand up at the Florida Supreme Court and argue against the death penalty in every single case. Because I don't believe in the death penalty whether you're guilty, and certainly not if you're innocent. But even if you're guilty, I don't believe that the death penalty is appropriate ever. So we brought in a conservative law firm so that the court would know that it's not just me up here, right? Like, this is legitimately really a travesty. And we had an oral argument in 2016, and we won a unanimous reversal from the Florida Supreme Court. So the Florida Supreme Court, which unanimously agrees on no things, unanimously said this is a travesty and he gets a new trial. Right? Because that's all they could do. In post-conviction, the only remedy is, can you get a new trial? They couldn't order him released. They could just say, all of this new evidence is really important, and a jury gets to hear it. So, the day the opinion came out, everybody's just like joyful, and Clemente tells a great story about how he was on the row, and the guys heard it on the news, and they're banging on the cells, and they're like, Shorty, they called him Shorty because he was 4'11". Shorty, you won. We get to talk to him the next day. And we're all hopeful. We're like, okay, well now, right, the state clearly, now the Florida Supreme Court told the state, basically in their opinion said that the daughter was a scapegoat, that Clemente was a scapegoat for the daughter's crimes. They could not have more clearly said what happened, that they believed that she was the actual killer. So we go back to the state attorney. That same day, they told the press they're continuing to move forward and continuing to seek the death penalty. So it would be 2 more years of litigation until November 5th, 2018, so he's coming up on his 5-year anniversary. During the retrial proceedings, we had picked a jury, we were doing some depositions, and a colleague of mine and a dear friend had done this amazing cross-examination of the boyfriend who had was basically the alibi. He was like, oh no, my girlfriend was with me the whole night. She didn't do this. We found his ex-wife and also listened to 1,000 jail calls. The boyfriend had been in jail, and he kept saying how he was a liar and he lied and he was lying about all these things. And then not on the jail call, but he had told the wife who he had spoken to on the phone that Samantha, that was the daughter's name, had climbed out the window that night. And so then the alibi was gone, right? The state still wouldn't agree right away. They were like, oh, well, he's a liar, but he's not lying about that. He's telling the truth about that. It's like, are you kidding me? But eventually they realized that his credibility was nothing, and they couldn't go forward. But they didn't tell us until the very last minute which we didn't know. But they had never bothered to put an immigration hold on Clemente because he had a death sentence, so they just never really thought about it. And then they realized their case was falling apart, so they went and put an immigration hold on him so that he would get deported if he even if they drop the charges. And he's so smart. They came to him, they told him he had a legal visit at the jail. So he came out, and it was like someone from immigration. They were trying to get him to sign a voluntary deportation. He's like, I'm not signing anything without my lawyer here, which was great. So but they put this hold on him. So we go into court on November 5th. They stand up and they drop the charges. And I think I just collapsed in my chair, and I was just like, I couldn't believe it was over. I mean, I had represented him at that point for 9 years. I had nightmares about his execution, about him being wrongfully executed and me just like banging on the glass. Like the level of injustice that was so much of a potential, it just was like overwhelming that it was sort of over. And he stood up in court without planning or preparation. The judge is like, do you have anything to say? And he's like, he read a scripture verse about God gave him angels so he wouldn't have to walk on rocks. And he talked about his lawyers being angels. And of course, everyone's just like, I mean, I'm bawling my eyes out. And then he looks at the prosecutors and he says, I don't have hate in my heart. And I was like, I do. And it was such in that moment, but obviously over time, it was such a remarkable experience of his grace because they stole his life. They stole 10, 14 years of his life. He had a girlfriend in Honduras that he was sending money to, and the hope was that she would be able to come and be with him and be together. And I met her when I went to Honduras, and when I met her, she was pregnant because she had obviously had to and did move on and married someone else. And he told her to, once he was locked up, he's like, Daniela, like you need to move on. But it was clear that she just still loved him and could see the life that she could have had. And so for him to just that day stand up and say that was such a remarkable thing to witness. And he's lived that way since. We were able to get him out on an immigration bond. He still has immigration pending. Our system is very broken, as I'm sure you can say, and his first appearance court date is next year. We're trying to figure out a way to get him to stay in the country, but he's here. He lives in Tampa, so I see him quite regularly, and he's been home almost 5 years now. And what's remarkable about it, and what I want to bring the story back to is, so one thing that's really important for me is to tell the truth about who we're executing. And the men and women, primarily men, we have a few women on Florida's death row, because they are all worth more than the worst thing that they've ever done. And so Clemente was very well liked while he was on death row. He was very likable. He was, had a lot of friends, as all of my clients do. And before he left, he told this story to me, but Michael Zach, who was the last person that Florida executed, who had an unimaginably horrific childhood. Sometimes I worry that I get desensitized by all of the violence. And then I read his story and I was just weeping. I mean, the abuse that he suffered as a child is just unspeakable. And yet, when he got to death row, he learned to read and write. He found pen pals. He found love. He found redemption. And he spent 27 years on death row. And he was a remarkable changed person. FADP was able to bring his sisters to visit him before his execution. He has a wife overseas that he met while he was on death row. And so there was a tremendous outpouring of support for his execution, and it was particularly difficult because we were killing a sweet, kind person who had changed. And before Clemente left the row, the day of Clemente's oral argument, they televised the oral argument, so they're allowed to watch the oral arguments. And it went really well. I mean, you could tell from the court that we were probably going to win. I think one of the arguments was the knife, the murder weapon. They had tried to argue that it came from Clemente's restaurant where he worked. But it was a really common kitchen knife. And one of the justices was like, I have that knife in my kitchen. And I was like, okay, this is going well. And so they knew that so Clemente and Michael were on the yard together, and he was like, Michael told Clemente, man, I watched your oral argument today, like, you're getting a new trial, but you're going home. I know it, brother, you're going home. And Clemente was like, I hope so. And Michael was like, I'm not. He's like, I'm never leaving here, I know that. I hope I don't die, but I'm not leaving here. I know that. But I want to live my best life as long as I can. And so Clemente said to him, if I'm alive and I'm not deported and I get out and it's your time, I'm going to be here. And so Clemente told me that he was coming to the execution vigil, and I attend every execution vigil. I go to Florida State Prison. Father Phil Agito in Daytona brings a whole group to FSP for the vigil. It's a prayer service. It's a beautiful, moving thing. If you have not attended, I really encourage you to try to go. It's a moving, beautiful experience where we celebrate and pray for the lives of the victims and their families, and also the person being executed. And so Clemente said he was going, and my first response was, no, you're not. I got you out of there. I'm not letting you go back. I couldn't stand to see him standing outside the prison that tried to take his life. And yet, he's a grown-up, and he's like, Maria, I need to do this. I need to be there. I promised him I would be. And so he came. And it was amazing and heartbreaking. And they asked him to speak, and he stood up and he spoke, and he told that story. And that's what I left with, and that's what I told our supporters the next day in our emails, and that's what I'm going to tell all of you. That's who's there. That's who's on death row. They are human beings who care about one another, who show up for one another. And unfortunately, sometimes the first time they've had community and love and acceptance is by the time they get to prison. And if we can intervene beforehand, and we can make a difference in our communities to stop that violence, I'll be a lot less busy. And I know I'm over time already. I could talk about this forever, but I very quickly, if there's questions, I'll answer them. And then I want you all, I have to leave, like I said, I have a flight because I have to try this death penalty case on Monday. One of the things I want to leave you with is we have offered life in that case on Monday. We've offered a life without parole sentence. And they're deciding over the weekend whether to accept it. Our client has made the offer. It took a long time to get there. There's a surviving victim. Her daughter was killed. She's alive. She's a wonderfully, remarkably generous and kind human. And so I'm asking you all to keep in your hearts and minds and prayers over the weekend and next week that the state accepts our life offer, and so that we can all choose life next week. And I want you to please come see me at the table. We have a QR code to join our petition so that you can subscribe to our emails, our newsletter, and we do a lot of things for every execution. There's vigils all over the state. I am always willing to come to your diocese and speak. We have a whole board of exonerees. Clemente speaks, Herman Lindsay. If you have an event and you want your community to know about the death penalty and about Florida and what's happening, please reach out. My card is there. It's my cell phone number. Text, call, email. We'll get you someone to talk about it. Because the only way we are going to bring about the end of the death penalty in Florida is to not stop talking about it. We must continue to tell the truth. And I'm committed to doing that, and I want you all to join me. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to answer questions if you have a few.